Good morning, everybody. My name is Ioannis Armakolas. I'm the head of the Southeast Europe program of ELIAMEP and a senior research fellow. And we are gathered here today to discuss a very interesting and increasingly important issue, which is the EU enlargement process. And the enlargement policy of the European Union used to be one of the most successful policies. Well, it brought the original 6 members of the club to 28 and later 27. But of course, in the previous decade, it became less and less important, and it was kind of sidelined by a number of other problems that the EU was facing. All that has changed, of course, since the invasion of Russia into Ukraine and the war that that has been going on for more than 2 years now. And the question is whether the war in Ukraine has made enlargement again a priority for the European Union and what to do about it. And for that, we have a stellar panel today with us. I will start with Lord Stuart, who is the Prime Minister of the UK Special Envoy for the Western Balkans. Next to him is Filip Ivanovic, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro. Then Nathalie Tocci, Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Peter Grk, Secretary General of the Bled Strategic Forum and National Coordinator for the Western Balkans at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. And last but not least, Professor Loukas Tsoukalis, also President of the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. We hope to have a very dynamic and quick discussion, and so I will ask my speakers to stick to 3 to 4 minutes per discussion, per answer, so that we have an opportunity to address several issues. And since this is not a very well-balanced when it comes to gender panel, I will start with my colleague and friend Nathalie Tocci. Dr. Tocci, Nathalie, let's stick to first names. Can you explain in simple terms why has the invasion in Ukraine changed our perspective of enlargement so radically? And what is exactly this geopolitical enlargement that many people are talking about in the EU these days?
So I would put it in these terms. After the completion of the Eastern enlargement, essentially, which was really driven actually on the one hand by a strategic rationale, the reunification of Europe, but also by a very strong transformational rationale. We lived in the good old days of the liberal international order, Europeanization, democratization, all good things. Basically, the EU stopped thinking, to some extent, maybe for even good reason, that enlargement was a strategic imperative. Why did it stop thinking so? Well, actually, because if by strategic what we actually mean is a security imperative, you could make the argument that, Turkey and the Western Balkans. In the Western Balkans, well, Turkey already a NATO member, Western Balkans increasingly, 3 out of 6, basically, with another 2 with a very heavy NATO presence. So the security rationale for EU enlargement was less dominant. Of course, what was still very dominant was the transformational, but that in and of itself was, on the one hand, obviously insufficient, otherwise something would have happened. And then, of course, by the time we get to the 2010s, that transformational logic, given the way in which the world was changing, was really losing a lot of its momentum, right? We were waking up to this reality that the world is big, bad, and ugly. We had to toughen up, and the whole issue of democracy and human rights was somewhat becoming less important. Then comes the invasion of Ukraine, and all of a sudden we realize, hang on a sec, we actually cannot afford not to enlarge for those security reasons. Of course, in the case of the Eastern Trio, unlike the Western Balkans, there is, of course, a strategic rationale precisely because NATO is not present. And so, in a sense, enlargement comes back because of this strategic rationale. Hence, then, believers in enlargement like ourselves basically saying, yes, but, you know, we don't want to forget about the Western Balkans. So the linkage between these two regions has to remain very firm. And how is it that we can break the logjam? I'm going to make my neighbor here very happy. Well, break the logjam by doing the relatively easy things as quickly as possible while that momentum is still there. The easy thing, obviously, is going to be neither, on the one hand, I don't know, Ukraine, for obvious, size reasons, nor, Serbia. The easy things that actually you could do tomorrow morning is my M&M formula, meaning Montenegro and Moldova. I'm not arguing here that everything is perfect in Montenegro, let alone Moldova, which has only just started. What I am saying is that actually it could take place by M&M, we could even have an NM, we could enlarge it, right? But it could happen relatively quickly to break the logjam and capitalize on that strategic momentum. Then, of course, you're left, but I'm going to leave it to my fellow panelists to take up the question, how is it that you retain the strategic transformational link rather than basically saying, well, if enlargement has to happen, no matter what, actually, you can close an eye or two on reform, be it within the candidate countries or be it within the EU itself.
Thank you, Nathalie. So that sets the stage for why enlargement policy, enlargement of the Union, has become important as a result of the war in Ukraine. But let's see now the risks and the problems. Professor Tsoukalis, Loukas, is there a risk in actually trying to accelerate this process of bringing in new countries? And if there is a risk, what is the answer? Is the answer in the institutional reforms, and what kind of institutional reforms?
Okay.
All that in 3-4 minutes.
Oh, sure. The European Union has both an interest and a duty in trying to export Pax Europea to less stable, less developed parts of the European continent. And of course, the interest and the duty has been strengthened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is one side of the story. The other side of the story is that we know, if we want to be honest with ourselves, that neither the European Union is ready to enlarge, nor are the candidates ready to enter by fulfilling the accession criteria. We certainly have no interest in turning the European Union into a model of dysfunctionality with 30-plus countries without changing the rules of the game internally. And that's why we are talking more and more about a different approach. And the different approach will include several things. Number one, that we will be talking in terms of integration by stages. So countries gradually participate in the process of European integration when they fulfill criteria in certain sectors and then move on to the next. So the waiting room for full membership does not become either nothing or everything, but it becomes a gradual process. But we should also be talking about needs for internal reforms. And internal reforms for the European Union can be summarized in terms of two words: institutions and money. We need to reform institutions. It's absurd to think that the European Union can function with vetoes for 30-plus countries. So we have to rely more on qualified majority voting. And it also is absurd to think that we can operate a union of 30-plus members in today's world with a budget that represents 1% of the European Union GDP. Are we ready to put our money where our mouth is? I'm not absolutely sure. But we have to put things on the table and be clear about it. Because if we simply say we enlarge without doing all the other things, it's going to be a disaster for all concerned.
Peter, I know that many argue that the opportunity for the institutional reform that comes together with enlargement is seen by some member states as the long-awaited opportunity to actually change the European Union in such a way that the strong will become stronger and the weak possibly will become weaker. I mean, you come from Slovenia, a relatively small country in the European Union, the same Greece where we are at the moment. What would be the perspective trying to find a balance between not weakening the weaker member states, but also maintaining the functionality, and how to reach a consensus for that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ioannis. Let me say at the beginning one thing, basically. You know what Loukas said regarding the veto and the 30+ members. I mean, we have now 27 and it doesn't really function very well with the veto also in 27. So I think if you look at enlargement, for example, you know, what happened with North Macedonia and so on and so on. So, you know, my first point is I agree completely with all that Nathalie said. My second point is internal reform of European Union shouldn't be an excuse to delay enlargement, especially with the countries which don't pose an absorption problem. And here I'm talking about Montenegro, I'm talking about Moldova. You know, I think internal reform shouldn't be an excuse to basically absorb a country of 600,000 people which already has a euro. So what I'm saying is strategic decisions need to be made. Look, Slovenia is a small country. We know that with the changement of voting procedures and everything, probably we are going to lose certain amount of power inside of the European Union. But if you see that the neighborhood is burning, if you see that basically the global community is changing, the new reality is coming, the multilateral system is not functioning, then you have to take, as a country, a strategic decision. This is why we propose, together with Germany, to actually change the procedures inside of the enlargement to make the enlargement quicker, meaning that, you know, you would have a qualified majority voting for all the stages of the enlargement process until the very end. Of course, when we decide about country entering the European Union, there would be an unanimous vote. But before that, basically, you know, we can go pretty quickly with the qualified majority voting, which would ease some of the problems that we have right now inside of the European Union. So, you know, to conclude, look, European Union is always changing, you know, and I think by the changement in the strategic reality of global community, we shouldn't use this as an excuse anymore not to do the enlargement. Because if we are not going to do it, if, for example, Montenegro is going to be ready by 2030, and we are going to use internal reforms as an excuse not to absorb Montenegro, then we are making another strategic mistakes. And in the last 20 years, since Thessaloniki, we have made a lot of them. So I hope that we learn something from the past mistakes. Thank you.
Nathalie, in your opinion, what are the absolutely necessary reforms that are required before the next accessions, or nothing?
Well, actually, I would say nothing. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, a case indeed like Montenegro, right? I mean, we already have, you know, sort of in the Lisbon Treaty, an annex that provides for institutional accommodation in terms of number of MEPs and what you do with the commission. So we have those rules, right? I mean, we only need to implement them. In terms of the budgetary implications of Montenegro, I mean, frankly speaking, kind of, you know, marginal, right? Do we need to reform decision-making? I would argue, I mean, you know, going back to the points that Loukas was making, these are things that we should be doing anyway, as Peter was saying, right? I mean, this is not a, decision-making is not, you know, unanimity is not a deal breaker on enlargement. In fact, it's a deal breaker preventing enlargement from happening, as we've seen, right? So these are, in a sense, opportunities that should be seized in the wake of enlargement, but they're not reasons not to do enlargement. Likewise, you can make a similar argument, you know, going to Ukraine. You know, should we be, you know, should the EU reform its common agricultural policy and cohesion policy Of course it should. Frankly speaking, it should be doing it regardless, right, of Ukraine. So seize it as an opportunity, given that as it stands, it's, you know, going to be a hard sell.
Okay, so we kind of nuanced a bit the picture when it comes to what is required in order to proceed with the enlargement policy. Let me now focus a bit more on the countries themselves, on the regions that are towards which we are supposed to be enlarging. And I will start with the Western Balkans. Lord Stuart, before Brexit, before the UK exited the Union, the European Union, Britain was one of the best supporters of the Western Balkans and one of the best supporters of enlargement policy. I mean, today, as an outsider these days, where do you see the biggest resistance to efforts from the region itself, from the Western Balkans, in efforts to bringing in the European Union, the Western Balkans, in fact, bringing the Western Balkans in the Western fold, I would say?
Well, the UK has been consistent, both in the European Union and outside the European Union in the last few years, in supporting security and stability across the region, the Western Balkan region. And we have never wavered in that commitment. We continue to support the peacekeeping forces. And the first point I'd like to add, agreeing with the panel, is, of course, NATO is worthy of mention as well for two reasons. The first is, of course, several states in the Western Balkans are already allies in NATO, and we, the UK, worked hard to support them in that process, and we continue to support them as allies. And that is important for the collective security of the whole of the continent, particularly the region that we're in. Secondly, it is sad for Europe that we still need a peacekeeping force in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 28 years after their conflict, and 25 years after the conflict in Kosovo. NATO's largest mission is in this region. The fact that we need those missions actually answers your question as to the security situation, and we continue to support the missions. And it's also true, therefore, that we still need the High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina until Bosnia and Herzegovina joins the European journey. So there's nothing inconsistent in UK policy. It's very consistent, and the UK continues to support EU accession across the region. Obviously, now we do it outside the European Union, but I would simply add to my colleagues on the panel, I think there is a word I would leave to the forum, which is this is urgent. And we can bandy around terms and times, but the urgency caused by Russia's illegal war has also awoken the whole of the Balkan Peninsula to the residual influence of Russia. It takes different forms. Some of it is quite mythical and historical, but it's real, and I don't think we should discount it. We should push back against misinformation wherever it's encountered. And if you look across the very vibrant media in the Western Balkan region, there is so much misinformation and fact-checking needed. And I think we need to be much quicker with that. And secondly, and I'll make a social point on purpose, despite my long security background, if we don't treat this problem as urgent, agreeing with my panelists, then more and more talented young men and women who live in the region will leave, thereby making the problem bigger and harder to solve. So we owe it to the next generation to bring them into the European Union with urgency.
Thank you. Minister Ivanovic, Filip, Montenegro is supposed to be the front runner in the Western Balkans when it comes to the accession negotiations. But it is also true that it has been negotiating to join the European Union for 12 years now. Now, that's the longest negotiation process that has ever been in the European Union, and no one expects that Montenegro will join in the next couple of years. So it will be, hopefully, when Montenegro joins, it will have been in the waiting room of negotiations the longest. Now, why negotiations have not been very effective, and reforms have not been very successful and effective before, and what has changed now, or what do you think will change now to make Montenegro as is expected by Peter and Nathalie ready to join the European Union very soon?
Well, I will be a little bit more nuanced with these claims. It is true that we have been negotiating for 12 years, but like in every relationship, you need two. So it's not just Montenegro's fault, so to say, that we are negotiating for 12 years, but we have also heard by my colleagues how European Union hasn't been thinking strategically about enlargement for quite some time. Although, and as you have mentioned, you said enlargement was one of the most successful, I would say the most successful policy of the European Union, so it was a little bit surprising why did it at certain point, well, not stop, but at least got prolonged. And in the case of Montenegro, I must also add that not just Montenegro went through certain changes, but also the attitude of the European Union towards the enlargement was changed. We started under one rules of the game. Then in 2017 or 18, we heard that there will be no enlargement before the 2025. So that was very discouraging for everyone. Then after that, we got the new methodology, which said that you cannot make progress in any chapters without making progress in chapters 23 and 24. Those are the rule of law and fight against organized crime and corruption. We accepted that methodology as well. So when you think about it, and we have been moving very, in a very speedy way in the past 5 months, specifically in chapters 23 and 24, we at the moment have 7 to 10 chapters ready to be closed, but they couldn't be closed before the progress in chapters 23 and 24. Different reasons occurred in the past years. I would say partially lack of the political will in Montenegro, partially lack of the possibility to reach consensus or compromise between different political forces in Montenegro, but also sort of enlargement fatigue that we have been experiencing in the European Union. Now, in the past 5 months, these things have changed in Montenegro, and I would say that the enlargement fatigue is no longer in the European Union for the past at least year and a half. So these two things are now complementary. And Montenegro has made an excellent progress in chapters 23 and 24, progress that we did in just 5 months that couldn't be done in years. So we are now working towards the fulfillment of the so-called benchmarks, which are the temporary criteria that we need to fulfill. We expect to get the interim benchmarks assessment report by the end of May. I think that there is, I would say, a consensus that this report is going to be positive. And once this report is positive, we can start closing those chapters that I said are ready to be closed. So from our side, the ambition is to finish the negotiation process by the end of the mandate of my government, which means in the next 3 or 3.5 years. And then, of course, we leave it to member states what they are going to do. But we are hoping that, and I heard my colleagues saying it, and I agree with them, if there is a problem in functioning within the European Union, of course, this is a discussion that EU member states need to do among themselves, but this should not be an excuse for missing the enlargement, or it shouldn't happen that the discussion on the internal reforms and the enlargement happen consecutively. We want it to go hand in hand and in parallel, so that within the next few years we are ready to become members and EU is ready to accept new members. And I think this is very realistic and very feasible by 2028 or 2029.
Okay. Peter, you had a brief comment for this?
Just a brief comment with what Stuart said regarding the urgency. You know, for 20 years when I was talking with my counterparts inside of the European Union or wherever, every meeting started with, Peter, you know, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the Western Balkans. I mean, I'm also concerned, you know, but this doesn't solve the problem. So we should move from just analyzing the situation in the Western Balkans to actually doing something. And I think we are in a good way. Since the Russian aggression on Ukraine, a lot of things changed, also the thinking inside of the European Union. And we made some steps. there are positive steps. Candidate status and start of negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina. I will just talk about the Western Balkans. Then North Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, and so on. So we did the steps. Now, I think the most important thing is not to stop here. And again, discuss on what needs to happen, what doesn't need to happen. Now, we are halfway, so we need to push even more so that, in 1 year's time, we are not going to discuss about how concerned we are about the Western Balkans, but how many time do we have until the next enlargement.
Loukas, you wanted to comment also. Can I ask you also whether in Brussels or certain member states there would be acceptable, the idea of having only one new member joining would be acceptable? I mean, would you have a referendum in France only for Montenegro, for example?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that when I talk about the need for reforms, both for the European Union and for the candidate countries, this is not an excuse to delay enlargement. It is simply reminding people that we have to be serious about the whole thing. And we haven't been serious for many years, because the way I usually present it in a cynical fashion is that for years, I mean Brussels and European institutions, have been pretending to negotiate for accession, and the candidate countries have been pretending to reform. And nothing happened until now. So I insist that unless we are serious about it, enlargement is going to be a failure if it happens. Number two, I think in most candidate countries, if again we want to be honest about it, there are still serious problems about the functioning of democratic institutions and rule of law. And we know from experience, and we know from the experience of our existing member countries, that EU membership is not a magical pill that cures all kinds of disease, okay? You do not become an EU member and suddenly you become a model of democracy, because we have some member countries already in the European Union which are far from being models of democracy and rule of law, okay? So again, the insistence is that if we talk about enlargement, it is not just a question of saying, okay, let's accelerate. Let's accept that the whole thing is complicated and we have to do it seriously to make it successful. Number three, I heard before that a major problem in the region is that the best and the brightest have been leaving, which is true. It's a huge problem. But the problem by itself would not be solved by EU membership. For many people in the countries concerned, EU membership means the right to emigrate to Germany and other countries. And this is not going to be solved simply by wishing it away. So we have to take measures to make sure that the best and the brightest stop leaving their countries. And this is going to be an issue that's going to be raised also in the internal market. And last but not least, referendums. Okay, there is the risk, I mean, we know it, that unless we prepare the ground, a country signs, after many years of agonizing process of negotiations, signs a treaty of accession, and then one member country, and I don't have to mention one, has a referendum and the referendum fails. So is that a successful operation? So we have to prepare the ground seriously. That's all I'm saying.
Nathalie, you also wanted to come in here, right? Briefly.
Well,
I will come back to the Balkans, unless if you want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, well, okay, in that case, before you go to the Balkans, I want to speak to this point. I mean, I agree with Loukas here. And I think that it connects to a point that I was making earlier. So if we start from the assumption that enlargement is and should happen, full stop, period, and then we say, how is it that you make a success of it? And there are ways in which you make a success of it by having a more credible process and staged and all the rest of it, that has to do with the transformation of the candidate countries. And then there's another conversation which has to do with the transformation of the EU. It's actually, I mean, Loukas was talking about his concerns about the former set of problems, right? I'm also concerned about the latter, Because, and this, just to introduce into the mix of the discussion, something that we haven't touched on, if, as, you know, people think and fear, I should add, there is going to be a right-wing surge in the EU moving forward, what are the implications for this conversation? Doesn't necessarily mean that enlargement is put on the shelf, because actually that strategic rationale applies even with a right-leaning EU. However, enlargement is not used, in that right-leaning EU, enlargement is not used as an opportunity to get serious on reform, be it of the candidate countries and especially be it of the EU itself. Can you imagine a right-wing EU moving towards qualified majority voting? Can you imagine a right-wing EU getting more serious on the EU budget and actually making it a real budget? So can you imagine the EU, for instance, getting more serious on internal forms of conditionality, given that we have now learned that democracy is not a destination, but it's a journey? That is where I think the problem is, but it's a problem that, in a sense, we're going to be facing regardless of enlargement.
Stuart, you mentioned Bosnia and Herzegovina. In December, the only country that was actually seriously mentioned, dealt with by the European Council was Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they're supposed to be doing the next serious step in the accession process, while at the same time the country seems to be at the verge of collapse internally, imploding. I mean, what to do about Bosnia and Herzegovina? I mean, we need to be serious, the international community, both EU and NATO, about it.
I was there this week, and I was in Brčko and Banja Luka. And as I made clear while I was there, and I make clear on all my visits, we have to be united. We have to be united to follow the fact, whether we like it or not, that the Dayton Agreement 28 years ago was meant to stop a war, which it did very successfully. It was not meant to be running a country 28 years later. What we need inside Bosnia and Herzegovina is the government to take advantage of this really very positive offer from the European Union and move more quickly to work through the issues that generates. And at the same time, sustain a safe and secure environment across the whole country, which is a federal state. And let's all of us commit to keeping the federal state of Bosnia and Herzegovina whole as one country and not allow this constant talk of secession and constant talk of division and ethnic nationalism, which of course suits Russia and others. And there is a European need to be united.
And how risky is the situation in Kosovo, relations between Kosovo and Serbia, for the region, for the future of the region?
Again, to be very brief and maybe hopefully not too brutal, we continue to need to be united on that issue too, to make sure that all European states, whether they're member states of the European Union or whether they're allies in the NATO alliance, including the UK and including the United States, commit to the Euro-Atlantic journey and make sure that both states honour their obligations, whether they're pre-existing agreements with the European Union, whether they're existing agreements between themselves, and also going back to the rule of law, which I think maybe has been a theme of this discussion, to ensure the rule of law applies. And so we continue to call on the state of Serbia to hold people to account for the incidents in Kosovo in September and the attacks against NATO peacekeepers, 93 NATO peacekeepers in hospital, May last year, and we continue to talk to Kosovo to make sure they honour their agreements. So really, this is the same sort of conversation about international governance and the rule of law.
Peter, I will give you the floor, but one question for Filip. Filip, Montenegro, one of the positive dimensions, aspects of Montenegro's reform process was how quickly and smoothly it aligned with EU foreign and security policy. Montenegro is one of the only 2 or 3 countries in the region that have aligned 100% with EU policy on these matters. I mean, will this change under the new government in Montenegro? Because we do hear some different voices from the new governing personnel in Montenegro. And for example, what will happen with the Council of Europe vote from the membership of Kosovo. Although this is not, of course, alignment with the EU policy, but...
Well, you answered the question. Montenegro was, is, and will remain 100% aligned with the common foreign and security policy of the European Union, and there have been no voices from the governing majority or from the government that were implying that this could change. Maybe some other voices implied that this could change, but I would just say that you should compare those voices with the effects, the results. So, as I said, it's a day-by-day business, alignment with the CFSP. We do it very smoothly and swiftly, and we will continue to do it, because it is basically not just a good dimension of our EU accession, but it is also envisioned and very specifically mentioned in the coalition agreement that was signed by the parties that formed the government and formed the parliamentary majority, and it's also envisioned explicitly in the work plan of the government given by the Prime Minister Spajic, and again, it's one of the pillars of our foreign policy. When it comes to the Council of Europe, well, I can just repeat what Sir Stuart said. We need to be united, and I would really like to see that there is a common position between the EU and NATO member states, because we are a NATO member state. We are aspiring to become EU member. On the other hand, of course, the Council of Europe membership requires fulfillment of certain criteria. Those criteria are basically rule of law, human rights, and democracy. The decision about Kosovo might come to the agenda of the Committee of Ministers in mid-May. There is still time until then, and of course, by viewing all these requirements and by consulting also with our friends and partners, we will reach the final decision when the time comes.
Peter, I will give you for the brief comment, but also wanted to add one question. Both Slovenia and Greece are members of this informal club, the Friends of the Western Balkans. What can Italy also, right, Nathalie? What can the Friends of the Western Balkans do to help the Western Balkans not be left behind in the accession process? And I should also mention, coming from Greece, that the Friends of the Western Balkans, or some of the Friends of the Western Balkans, are also responsible for some of the delays in the accession process through the bilateral disputes which continue. So what can the Friends of the Western Balkans do more?
Yeah, thanks. I hope that by now we have all the European countries being friends of the Western Balkans, not just us, if we want to do really enlargement seriously, as Loukas said. One thing, when you said that Bosnia is imploding, look, European Union is imploding for the last 20 years and it's still here. Western Balkans is imploding for the last 20 years and it's still more or less stable. So basically, I think that what we should focus on is on the good things, I mean, when we changed the policy towards the Western Balkans, and I call it positive pressure, things changed in terms of reforms also in the Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the last 2 years, the country did more reforms because of this positive pressure of European Union, more for more approach, than it did in the last 10. So it can be done. What I'm saying is that we need to continue with this, and the Friends of Western Balkans, what we can do is set an example. We can bilaterally send our experts down to the region, which we are already doing, but probably we could do more. We should keep on continuing putting the enlargement and whys and hows on the agenda of the European Union Council formations and so on and so on. So basically, there are a lot of things that we can do, but the most important thing is to keep European Union doing positive pressure on the countries of the Western Balkans to do the necessary reforms and to be ready. And I think in the last year or the last 2 years, what we are doing is the right way to go.
Loukas, in our title, the title of our panel, we have this date 2030, which is not official, but it has been mentioned by the President of the European Council. Is it helpful to have a date as a kind of goal, as a milestone?
The President of the European Council, soon to be outgoing, has mentioned the date. It is useful to have dates as targets. If you ask my opinion, I would say that at best, perhaps 1 or 2 countries may be ready to join by 2030. It may take longer, and I believe that the approach will be integration by stages. So that is the answer. So it's not going to be a candidate or a full member. It's going to be a gradual integration. And that, I think, is going to be the formula to be adopted.
And in 2 sentences, what are your expectations from the new Commission in order to put this process into a solid path?
Well, nobody knows what the new Commission will look like, because what the Commission looks like depends partly on what happens in June in the European elections, but it also depends largely on the bazaar negotiations that are going to take place within the European Council to agree on the package of the new European leadership. But I'm pretty confident that enlargement will remain at the top of the political agenda, and I think it should be there. So it is a priority for the European Union for a variety of obvious reasons. But I insist, a priority should be coupled with the ability to put, among other things, our money where our mouth is.
Nathalie, I think you have a comment, but also quick question. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 steps that if you see in the next Commission, you will say, well, now we are serious about enlargement?
So firstly, on this issue of the date, which is then connected to your question. Now, if we were starting from a clean slate, yeah, then indeed, you know, I think the argument that one often hears, for instance, by Germany has certain validity. I mean, it is true that if you have a date, then what exactly are you saying? That regardless of what happens in the candidate countries and regardless of what happens in the EU, they should enter nonetheless? So I think there's a certain argument to say that going back to, you know, the transformational logic of enlargement is weakened by a date. However, we do not start from a clean slate. We start from a situation in which our credibility has been dramatically undermined. Our EU credibility, right? Because we have not been serious. And so the point about the date is precisely that of signaling. So going to your question, what would be the signals, right? Well, you have, in the same way as President Juncker started his mandate by saying that during his mandate there will not be enlargement, you have the next Commission President going to the European Parliament and saying that during her or his mandate there will be enlargement. That would be an important signal. Another important signal coming from the member states that created this problem in the first place is the point that Peter was mentioning, i.e. there is absolutely no treaty requirement for unanimity for the opening and closing of each and every chapter, right? That can be, you know, that can be decided overnight to get rid of it. It didn't exist before, right? Which is a different point to, obviously, unanimity for a treaty change, which is what accession would eventually require. That can happen. That is a signal of seriousness. And then, of course, there's the money part of the equation, right? Which obviously then becomes intertwined with the negotiations beginning on the next MFF. If we are, and if we want to be ready for enlargement by that date, well, surely we should be seeing this playing out in the negotiations over the budget.
And I think I will give the final comment to the minister, to the representative of the Western Balkans, Filip. The same question. We have the next commission in a few months. We don't know whether it's going to be in 3-4 months or a bit more. From your point of view, being the front runner of 10 countries that would like to join the European Union, what do you see as 1 or 2 steps that will convince your government, but also your public, that this is serious and now we are in the process of actually joining the European Union relatively soon?
Let me say a few things. First of all, we are doing this process for ourselves because it has really transformed the Montenegrin society and the country for the better, and we believe if we continue with the reforms, especially in the area of rule of law and anti-corruption, that it will become even better. So this is number one. Number two, we support all candidate countries on their EU membership path. So it means that every country that wants to become EU member, we think it should become EU member. But on the other hand, we also support the merit-based approach, which means that if we are the front runner and we fulfill all the conditions, we want to be the first next member of the EU. And then from within the EU, we will help also the others. And going back to your question, then I would completely agree with Nathalie. I started my talk here today by precisely referring to 2018 promise that there will be no enlargement by 2025, which was very discouraging. Now we have the year 2030, which is, it could work as discouraging, but it's actually encouraging because nothing happened in the past years. So if we get a new president of the European Commission and he or she says, by the end of my mandate, there will be enlargement, it's a good thing. And the other thing is precisely next year, the financial framework, it should, I think, include one new member state, and that would be a very good proof that, okay, it's happening. So, and that they are serious.
Thank you.
So that's what I expect.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists.